I ran into an old friend of mine named Chip, and I brought him along here. He's a bit shy, so he didn't want to be revealed too early, but I told him I wouldn't force him to say anything. He could just sit there. So that's okay. Okay? Some of you were around maybe for the 70s or when they had a pet rock. Yeah. What a marketing genius that guy was, right? Okay, here you go, Chip. He's got a little bed for him there. All right, so I bumped into him, and he wanted me to share the story. I had no idea that he had such a story to share. But when he got going, you wouldn't know it, but he's quite chatty. So I would like to share with you today a story that he told me it was called Rollin Into Resurrection Sunday. So this is he just told me to write this down, okay? So this is Chip telling us this story. I've been around for a long time, like 3,500 years. And while much of my life has not been what you'd call a riveting tale, I've had a few seasons where I've seen some history made. Most of my history was like water under a bridge. Actually, I was born near the water, and I lived under a bridge over in Germany for about 265 years. But that's another story. There's been so much happen over the years, but let me tell you about one of those unique seasons that I'll never forget. Each year around this time, I'm reminded of that monumental week that took place about 2,000 years ago. Around 1,500 years before that, I came into my own on the site of a building project near Jericho. There was a house being built near a stream, and my brothers and I were byproducts of the builder who was shaping an old block to fit the house. My parents named me Chip. I was quite sharp at first, but a few hundred years in the stream and I became quite smooth. Actually, one of my little brothers, Billy, he was picked up by a guy named David. And I never saw Billy again, but I heard he went on to make quite an impact. Through a series of events, I found myself along the road that went up to Jerusalem, near the Golden or the Eastern Gate. They called it either. It took a number of years, but as the people and the carts passed by, I slowly rolled uphill. That was hard work. Though I'd heard from Uncle Iggy a few years earlier that he had a fun gig going up and down hills with a guy named Sisyphus. Life was exciting by that gate. You never knew what was going to pass by or who was going to pass by. One day there was a big commotion and a man came riding toward the gate on a donkey. Just like every year at that time, there was a migration of people who came to the city for a one-day festival called Passover, followed by a 7-day festival of unleavened bread. The crowds were loud, and it was deafening, like a rock concert. They laid jackets and blankets on the ground while waving palm branches, and they said, "Hosanna! Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." There were others in the crowd who didn't like that at all. They said to the guy on the donkey, "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." "I tell you," he replied, "if they keep quiet, the rocks will cry out." This was my big chance. I was ready. I had never spoken audibly before, but I knew the Creator could do anything, and I was ready to shout a blessing for the King. I'd even conceived of an interpretive dance, but dancing is very difficult for rocks. Alas, Jesus did not rebuke his disciples. They kept cheering, and he kept on riding into the city. What a party! So much joy and hope were expressed that day. He passed me by, and I overheard him say something a bit mysterious while he was crying. If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. What do these enemies have against me and my relatives? Just because we like to be stacked and used in buildings doesn't mean you can't leave one stone on another. That's not a crime. It didn't make much sense at the time, especially because the whole day was a celebration. But in the year AD 70, I tell you, I saw some things nobody should have to see when the city of Jerusalem was sacked. On that day, after the king passed by on the donkey, I found myself picked up by a child. At first, it was a feat of strength for a 3-year-old. But soon the older brother grabbed me out of his hand to tease the little guy. I was slipped onto a cart that was passing by with doves as cargo, headed for the temple, as the older brother feigned innocence over the passing 3-year-old's cries to his mother. We arrived at the temple around the same time as the man who had been on the donkey, and just before the big disturbance. Evidently, the king wasn't happy because as the cages of the doves were being offloaded, he started going around flipping over tables, and money started flying everywhere. He was upset. He yelled something about the temple being a house of prayer, not a den for robbers. I thought those men were legitimate businessmen. Guess not. As he moved on, things got cleaned up quickly, especially the money. And as the tables were reset, one of the vendors found me on the ground and used me to weigh down the corner of his tablecloth. He wanted me to point this out. He's just right here. That was to help keep the wind from blowing it off. I was fortunate to get a decent view of the courtyard, actually. It turns out the guy from the donkey was named Jesus, and he came to the temple every day that week. He would sit on the steps and teach. And when the blind and the lame came to him, he healed them. Even the children started singing tunes that were prophetic, like, "Hosanna to the Son of David." Man, did that ever tick off the teachers of the law. They wanted him to shut the kids up, and I thought I might get another chance to cry out and do my interpretive dance. But Jesus just said, "From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise." One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple courts and proclaiming the good news, the chief priests and the teachers of the law, together with the elders, came up to him. "Tell us by what authority you are doing these things," they said. "Who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered with a question for them, but they were stumped. They got into a huddle and discussed it furiously. But in the end, they answered with a, "We don't know." These were the experts out of the whole country. These were the top guys. So Jesus told them he would not tell them the answer to the question they asked. I could tell these men who questioned Jesus were powerful men by the robes they wore and the deference given to them by all those around. Except Jesus. He kept teaching, and they kept interrupting. But these men were gluttons for punishment and made attempts every day to trap him or to trick him with sophisticated questions. But he had responses that made it look easy and made them look bad. So he went on to tell the people a parable that didn't make the religious leaders look very good. Then asked them, "Then what is the meaning of that which is written? The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." I perked up when I heard Jesus talking about stones again. Perhaps he was referring to one of my relatives, Great Uncle Iggy. The teachers didn't know what it meant, or at least didn't comment, but you could tell they were seething in anger. As I heard a few others discuss it later, I concluded that Jesus was referring to himself as the stone that the builders rejected. When that happens, it usually means that the stone is not a good fit for the project. But instead of being discarded, that stone became the cornerstone for a different building. See, the cornerstone is very important because it's the first stone set in the construction of a masonry foundation. That's with brick or with rock or stone. All other stones of the building will be set in reference to that stone, thus determining the position of the entire structure. Man, when I was younger, I used to dream of being a cornerstone. It's the most important job a rock could ever be chosen for. This Jesus must have been more important than I realized if he's claiming a label like cornerstone. Each day, Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. And all the people came early in the morning to hear him at the temple. One day, some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God. I agreed. I felt so fortunate to be holding down a tablecloth in such a prestigious location. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." Again, I was a bit hurt by the comment at the time, because stacking is not a crime. But this was just another reference to the destruction of the temple that was coming a few years later. Now, the festival of unleavened bread, called the Passover, was approaching. And from where I sat on the table, I could overhear conversations where the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then late one evening, one of the 12 guys who hung out with Jesus all the time came to the temple without the rest of the crew. I heard the leaders call him Judas. He went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. I was stunned. Couldn't believe my ears, so to speak. But they were delighted and agreed to give him some silver. He agreed to the terms and then left to look for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. That was so underhanded. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." These men came to the temple to get a lamb and some supplies for the meal. Well, the vendor, whose table I was on, as you can see, agreed with the priests and the teachers that this Jesus fellow was bad news. He recognized Peter and John as being from the gaggle of troublemakers that hung out with Jesus, and so he determined to rip them off. They had hoods up, and they were quite cautious, looking around and hoping not to be recognized. They obviously weren't paying close attention because the vendor put me in the bottom of the bag of supplies before weighing it on the scale and charging them a fortune for the things they needed. They got out of the temple without any trouble and returned to the home where they prepared the meal. When he found me in the bottom of the sack, Peter's words made him sound like a sailor. I was placed outside the door, so I don't have a real clear account of the Passover meal that they celebrated there. But I can say all 12 guys showed up on time for the meal. Even that guy Judas, whom I'd seen at the temple. I thought, that guy's got a lot of nerve coming here. But he was just as welcome as the rest. But I did see him leave earlier than others. The meal was quiet for the most part. Jesus retold the story of the Exodus when Moses led God's people out of the slavery in Egypt. I strained to listen in because I love that story. I heard it growing up because it spoke of my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa Dwayne, who is one of the only 2 rocks in history to have water flow out of them. The other was Craggy Maggie. We don't talk about her much because of the feud. Jesus told it a little differently than my family did, but the result was the same, and God's salvation was evident. There was some feet washing, and they shared some bread and some wine before it got real quiet around that time. I couldn't quite hear what Jesus was saying, but I did hear the word love a lot, and the mood got quite somber. After the meal, they all left the house following Jesus. Peter had mentioned to one of the others that they should be prepared for anything, so I was picked up as the last one left the house. I guess I'm weighty enough to hurt when hurled. We walked a short way to some sort of garden. It had a funny name, Gethsemane, I think. It was dark and it was getting late. Jesus told some disciples to stay at one spot and invited a few to go further with him. The guy I was with put me down as we were in a quiet and private part of the garden. I couldn't see much, but Jesus withdrew about a stone's throw beyond, and he knelt down. I think he was praying. When he came back, he was disappointed to find the guy sleeping, and he had asked for a kerchief because, was that right? It looked like drops of sweat, but no, it was blood on his forehead. While Jesus was speaking, a crowd came up, and a man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, "Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was it. That was the guy from the temple. This was the moment of betrayal. So that's why he left the Passover meal early. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, "Lord, should we strike with our swords?" And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. But Jesus answered, "No more of this." And he touched the man's ear, and he healed him. The rest of the guards stood dumbfounded. Things had gotten pretty tense, but that took it down a couple notches. I mean, Jesus literally reattached the guard's ear to his head. That's never been done before. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." So they arrested Jesus. After the ear incident, Peter put his sword away, but picked me up, held me just out of sight, ready to throw at the soldiers. He carried me away as he followed the guards at a distance to see where they were taking Jesus. After what had just happened, I could tell that Peter was nervous because his palms were sweaty, and I could feel his racing heartbeat pulsate as he gripped me tight. Peter sat down in the courtyard of the home of the high priest, placed me on the ground behind him, and as he sought to warm himself by the fire, we sat there all night while Peter had a number of spirited conversations. Then the strangest thing happened. This tough man, who had stood up with his sword and cut off the ear of the soldier and carried me along as a potential weapon just in case, began to weep as a rooster crowed. He turned his face away from the other people, and several salty tears landed on me. I've never seen anyone get so emotional over a rooster. I could see from a distance that the guards who had brought Jesus to the home started to mock and beat Jesus. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. I thought to myself, watch out, suckers. Jesus is going to teach you a lesson you won't forget. I mean, this is the man who spoke a few words and caused the wind and the waves to calm down in the midst of a storm. The story was passed around through all creation. The water told my cousin Shelley, who was on the shore, all about it. Unbelievable. These guys did not know who they were dealing with. Yet there was no response. Jesus just took it. It was a long night. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. In the courtyard, I was picked up by a priest with the nickname Rockin' Robin. He was known as a guy who was always ready to stone somebody on a moment's notice. A blasphemy here, grab a rock. An adultery there, grab a rock. In his mind, there was never a bad time for a stoning, especially for those who violated God's law. He's the one who carried me along to the court of Pilate. Robin put me down after one of his colleagues, who knew his reputation, saw me and gave him a dirty look. The whole thing with Jesus needed to be done by the Romans. No stoning today. Pilate asked Jesus some questions, but they didn't find any basis for charges against Jesus. So the whole crowd left there as Jesus went somewhere else. I overheard the name Herod, but it wasn't long before Jesus was brought back to Pilate's courtyard. But this time he was dressed in an elegant robe that would have made him look quite regal if it wasn't for the giant bruises on his face. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who is inciting people to rebellion. I've examined him in your presence, and I have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he's done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him." Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together the crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. Pilate wanted to release Jesus, but the crowd kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. It was surreal. Did these people not know who was standing before them? Had they not seen the signs? The crowd was so insistent that Pilate finally gave in to their demands. I think he was afraid. He released some other guy and sent Jesus to his death. As the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon, a guy named Simon. He's from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country. And they put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus, who had been beaten so bad he was unrecognizable. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. As they were leaving the courtyard, one of the crowd was pulling a cart loaded with supplies for the soldiers. He noticed the wheel of the cart was wobbling, so he picked me up to pound the axle pin back into place to secure the wheel. He tossed me into the cart in case the wheel came loose again. The Romans don't tolerate delays. As I found my way to Golgotha with the large processional, I noticed that 2 other criminals were also led out with Jesus to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there along with the 2 criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. Now, Jesus had a hard time breathing. I learned that that's actually how crucifixion kills, through a combination of bodily malfunctions that include asphyxiation. And the victim is required to elevate their body with the nailed legs to draw breath. And eventually the pain is too great and their strength leaves their body so they can no longer breathe. Jesus still had breath and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." And I saw the soldiers divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he's God's Messiah, the supposed chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself. there was a written notice above him which read this: "This is the King of the Jews." I didn't have words. Man, those guys were so ignorant. Then the biggest fool spoke up. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at Jesus. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But actually, the other criminal on the other side hanging there rebuked him. He said, "Don't you fear God? Since you are under the same sentence, we're getting what we deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus answered him, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." I've been around a long time, but I have never seen anything like what happened next. All creation was responding to what was happening. It was bizarre. But the death of this man affected everything. Light disappeared. The wind picked up and began howling. Flowers closed and shrank. And I could feel a heaviness in and around me that I have never felt before or since. Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." When he had said this, he breathed his last. The lead soldier, one of the ignorant ones from earlier, seeing what happened, praised God and said, "Surely this was a righteous man." This is where my first-hand account of the most memorable week in history cuts out. I was left there at the place of the skull and became part of a fire pit for the guards who held executions there on a regular basis. However, I can't share the rest of the story as I received it from reliable relatives. Aunt Sandy told me about the series of events that led Cousin Grant he was gifted the honor of his life. And so this is what Aunt Sandy told me. There was a man named Joseph, a member of the council. He was a good and upright man who had not consented to their decision or action. But he came from the Judean town of Arimathea, and he himself was waiting for the kingdom of God. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body. Then he took it down off the cross. He wrapped it in linen cloth and placed it into a tomb cut in the rock, one in which no one had yet been laid. When the tomb was cut out of the rock, I gained millions of cousins, but Grant was given the privilege of retaining his size, and he was chiseled into a large round stone that would serve as the door of the tomb. That's right, Grant was the door of the tomb where Jesus, the King, was laid. And boy, was there a flurry of activity that weekend. For inside the tomb, he guarded all of the things he guarded. Everything started out as it was meant to be. It's a tomb, right? Calm, quiet, cold, until it wasn't. After a few days of having this dead man lying inside, he felt a warmth begin to creep in. Something was happening. The dead man sat up. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found that Cousin Grant had been rolled away from the entrance of the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. Grant could hardly contain himself. He saw what had happened, and he was giddy with excitement. While the women were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. This surprised Cousin Grant as well. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again." Then the women remembered Jesus' words. Grant couldn't believe the privilege that he had had the privilege of seeing Jesus return to life firsthand. Well, it took 4 men to move Grant into place to seal the tomb. Somehow, and this never happened again, somehow Grant was able to move himself when Jesus was ready to come out. It ends up that all the disciples didn't quite expect this series of events. Jesus ended up revealing himself to them in a variety of ways. And this is where my story ends, because you can read that for yourself, as Matt, Mark, Luke, and John all wrote it down. Thanks, Chip. So, the kids have a little thing to remember. And if you want a stone too, you're welcome to get one after. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. If you make Jesus your cornerstone, all other parts of your life can begin to come into proper alignment in reference to Him. Just as the cornerstone determines the position of the whole structure, Jesus, our cornerstone, determines the posture of your whole life. A life of love. Through His death and resurrection, Jesus made a way for your sins to be forgiven and to align yourself with God, who is a loving Father. There is no greater pursuit in life than to know and walk with God. There is no greater pursuit in life than to know and walk with God. When you set Jesus at the center of your life and you learn to obey His words, you build on a firm foundation, a foundation that will last. Happy Easter.